My dad passed away on a Tuesday morning in March, and by Friday afternoon I was sitting in a lawyer's office listening to a man in a gray suit tell me that my father had left me absolutely nothing. Not the house I helped him renovate room by room over 4 summers. Not the savings account I'd watched him build for 30 years. Not the business he'd run out of our garage since I was 7 years old. Nothing. Every single asset, every dollar, every piece of property, all of it went to my sister Danielle. The sister who hadn't visited him in over 2 years. The sister who couldn't be bothered to drive 4 hours to see him when he was in the hospital getting a stent put in his heart. The sister who sent a fruit basket, an actual fruit basket from a website, when he had pneumonia last winter and was so weak he could barely lift a spoon. A fruit basket with a little printed card that said, "Get well soon, love Danielle and the family." Not even her handwriting. And she got everything. I sat in that chair across from the lawyer and I felt something happen inside me that I don't have a good word for. It wasn't grief exactly. It wasn't rage, though that came later. It was more like the floor dropped out from under me and I fell through it and I kept falling and there was nothing to grab onto. The lawyer was still talking. He was saying something about the date the will was signed and something about uncontested and something about the timeline for asset transfer. I heard the words, but they weren't reaching me. I was somewhere else entirely. I was back in my dad's kitchen, 19 years old, sitting across from him at the table while he told me that family was everything and that no matter what happened in this world, we took care of each other. I was back there, and I was thinking about how completely, how devastatingly wrong he turned out to be. But to explain that, I need to go back further than that lawyer's office. I need to go back to the beginning, because nothing about what happened makes sense unless you understand what our family was before it became what it became. I'm the older daughter. My name is Claire, and I'm 36 years old, and I spent most of my adult life doing everything right by a man who in the end decided I wasn't worth a single line in his will. My sister Danielle is 3 years younger than me. We grew up in a small town in Ohio, the kind of place where everybody knows everybody, and your family's reputation follows you around like a shadow. Our dad, Robert, everyone called him Rob, ran an electrical contracting business out of our house for most of our childhoods, before it grew big enough to justify an actual office space. Our mom, Patricia, died when I was 14 and Danielle was 11. Breast cancer, fast and brutal, the kind that doesn't give you much warning before it takes everything. And that was when everything about our family shifted in a way that none of us ever fully acknowledged or dealt with. Before my mom died, things were pretty normal. My dad worked long hours. My mom kept the house running and took care of us and drove us to school and made sure we did our homework. Danielle and I fought the way sisters fight, over the bathroom, over the TV remote, over whose turn it was to set the table. Nothing serious, nothing that suggested what was coming. But after my mom died, something changed in my father that he never really came back from. He grieved her. I know that now as an adult. I understand it. But the way his grief expressed itself was not equal, He pulled Danielle closer, and he pulled away from me at the same time. And I spent years trying to understand why, and I'm still not completely sure I do. I think part of it was that Danielle looked like my mom. Same dark hair, same round face, same way of tilting her head when she was thinking. I looked like my dad's side of the family. Tall, angular, brown eyes, serious expression. When he looked at Danielle, he saw my mother. When he looked at me, I don't know what he saw. Maybe he saw himself, and maybe that wasn't comforting. Or maybe there was no deep reason at all. Maybe he just loved her more and never had the courage to admit it, even to himself. Whatever the reason, the favoritism was real, and it was constant, and it shaped everything about how Danielle and I move through the world. She got away with things I would have been punished for. She got the car when she turned 16, and I had to wait until I was almost 17, and I only got it because I begged. She got her college tuition paid in full, and when I asked about college funds, my dad sat me down with this pained expression and explained that he'd had a rough year with the business and things were tight. I believed him. I was 18 and I believed him. And I took out student loans and worked 2 jobs and got myself through a state school over 4.5 years. And I never resented him for it, the way maybe I should have. I told myself that was just how it was sometimes. I told myself money was complicated. Danielle went to a private university in Pennsylvania with a pretty campus and a good business program, and came back with a degree and a sophisticated way of dismissing things she didn't like, and a social circle that was clearly better than anything she'd grown up with. She started dating a guy named Marcus, who worked in finance in Columbus. They got engaged when she was 27 and had a big, beautiful wedding that my dad paid for. I know, because I helped him figure out the budget and watched him write the checks, and moved into a house in a suburb of Columbus that had a finished basement and a 3-car garage. They had 2 kids, Lily and Noah. They looked like a catalog family. They looked perfect from the outside. I got married too, to a man named Derek, when I was 29. My dad contributed $2,000 to our wedding, and I was grateful because I knew he was going through a lean period with the business. That's what I told myself. That's what I always told myself. After my sister moved to Columbus, something started to shift in how often she came home. At first it was gradual. She'd come for Christmas and Thanksgiving, and Dad's birthday in June. And then it was Christmas and Thanksgiving, and then it was just Christmas. And then it was Christmas every other year, because they started doing holidays with Marcus's family. My dad never said anything about it, at least not to me. He would just mention her in conversation, the way you mention someone you're proud of, casually, like she was always present, like the distance wasn't real. Danielle says, he would start, and then tell me something she'd texted him, and I would nod and think how strange it was that a text could feel like a relationship. Meanwhile, I lived 40 minutes away from my dad. 40 minutes. And after Derek and I had our son, Tommy, that distance felt even shorter because Tommy loved his grandpa, and my dad genuinely lit up around him. I'd bring Tommy over on weekends. I'd drive my dad to his doctor's appointments when his vision started getting bad enough that he was nervous on the highway. I'd sit with him on his porch in the summer and drink coffee and listen to him talk about the business, which by then he'd turned over to a manager named Phil because he'd semi-retired at 68. I helped him with his taxes 2 years in a row when his accountant retired and he didn't want to find a new one. I cleaned out my mom's belongings from the attic when he finally decided he couldn't look at the boxes anymore. 6 hours on a hot July Saturday. Me and Derek going through 30 years of my mother's life, while Danielle sent a text saying she was sorry she couldn't be there, but Noah had soccer camp. I want to be clear. I didn't do those things to earn anything. I did them because he was my father, and I loved him, and he was getting older, and I worried about him. When he had the stent put in, I slept in the hospital waiting room. I brought him soup for a week after he got home. When the pneumonia hit, I moved him into our house for 3 weeks until he was strong enough to take care of himself again. I set up a little bedroom in our guest room, and I bought a baby monitor so I could hear if he needed anything in the night. I didn't tell Danielle about the baby monitor because I knew somehow she'd find a way to make it weird, to make it about control or hovering or something. I just did it. All of that happened. All of that was real. And none of it mattered in the end, when it came to what was written on the page. The first time I had any sense that something might be wrong. Not wrong in a vague, emotional way, but wrong in a concrete, practical way, was about 8 months before my dad died. He'd had a good stretch of health after the pneumonia, and we'd fallen into a comfortable routine. I'd come over on Sundays, sometimes with Tommy, sometimes on my own. He'd make coffee, and we'd sit at the kitchen table and talk about nothing in particular, and I was grateful for it. I was just glad he was okay. One Sunday in July, I arrived and he was on the phone. He held up a finger to let me know he'd be a minute, and I went into the kitchen to put on water for coffee the way I usually did. His office was just off the kitchen. He'd converted the dining room into a workspace years ago, after he semi-retired and started doing the bookkeeping for the business from home. The door was half open. I wasn't snooping. I just happened to glance through the doorway while I was waiting for the kettle, and I saw a folder on the desk with the words, "Last Will and Testament," printed on the tab in the kind of typeface that legal documents use. That alone wasn't alarming. People have wills. My dad had a will, I knew that. He'd mentioned it years ago after my mum passed, and he had to figure out what she'd left behind. I looked at that folder and felt nothing, except a vague, distant awareness that old people have paperwork. Then he came into the kitchen, and when he saw me looking in the direction of the office, something crossed his face. It was quick. If I hadn't known him as well as I did, I might have missed it. But I'd been reading his expressions for 36 years, and what I saw was discomfort. Not guilt exactly, just a closing down, like a window being shut. "Everything okay?" I said. Fine, he said. "Just some paperwork." "The will stuff?" I said it lightly, the way you say things you're not particularly worried about. "Just updating some things," he said. "Nothing exciting." He changed the subject. We drank coffee, and he told me about something Tommy had said on the phone, and we talked about the weather and the neighbor's new fence, and whether Phil was managing the business the way he should be. And I filed that moment away somewhere in the back of my mind, in the drawer where you put things that make you slightly uneasy, but not uneasy enough to confront. I should have confronted it. I know that now. I know that the way you know things in hindsight, with perfect, useless clarity. 2 months later, Danielle came to visit. This was significant because visits had become rare, and this one was unannounced in the sense that she didn't tell me she was coming. She called my dad directly, which was her right, obviously, but the fact that she didn't mention it to me, we weren't close, but we weren't estranged. We texted, we called on birthdays. Felt pointed. I only found out when I called my dad on a Thursday evening to check in, and he mentioned offhandedly that Danielle was there, that she'd come for a few days, that they were having a nice time. He sounded happy in a way that was hard to hold up against. "Oh," I said, "that's great. Tell her I said hi." There was a pause, just a breath's worth, just long enough to feel like something. "I will," he said. She was there for 4 days. I didn't hear from her once. I didn't hear from my dad much either. Just a quick call the second day to tell me everything was fine. Don't worry, he'd talk to me soon. When he called me the week after she left, he seemed different is the word I keep coming back to. Not mean. My dad was never mean, but careful, like he was choosing his words more than he normally did. I asked him what they'd done while she was there, and he said they'd gone to dinner a couple of times and watched some movies and talked about a lot of things. "What kind of things?" I asked, and he said, "Oh, you know, life, the future," and then he moved on to something else. I want to tell you that I confronted this directly, that I sat him down and asked him point blank what was going on, and that we had an honest conversation about it. But that's not what happened. What happened is that I did what I always did with the things that made me uneasy. I told myself a story that made it okay. I told myself Danielle had finally stepped up. I told myself my dad was getting his affairs in order, the way older people do. And that probably part of that was reconnecting with his younger daughter, and that this was a good thing, a healthy thing. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself I trusted him. The fall went by. Thanksgiving, Danielle sent her apologies. Noah had a cold and they didn't want to travel. Christmas, she came for 2 days with Marcus and the kids, stayed at my dad's house, left before New Year's. I saw her for about 4 hours at a family dinner that was awkward in the polite, performative way family dinners get when everyone's pretending everything is fine. She hugged me when she arrived. She hugged me when she left. She told me Tommy was getting so big, and I told her Lily and Noah were gorgeous, and we meant none of it, and we both knew it. My dad spent Christmas looking at Danielle the way he always looked at Danielle, like she hung the moon, like just having her in the room was a gift. I watched him watch her, and I felt for the first time in a long time the old ache of it. That particular pain that has no clean name, the one that comes from knowing you are loved but not chosen, that you are there but not seen, that you are good enough to lean on but not enough to light up a room. I went home that night and I hugged Derek too hard and cried a little in the bathroom before I went to bed. And I told myself I was being ridiculous. And I fell asleep with that heavy, grey feeling that was becoming too familiar. My dad's health declined quickly after Christmas. In January, he was tired all the time. In February, he had a bad fall in the bathroom, He called me from the floor, and I drove over in 20 minutes and found him sitting with his back against the tub, pale and shaken, but okay. No broken bones, just bruised. I helped him up and made him tea and sat with him for 2 hours until the color came back to his face. I called his doctor. I set up a follow-up appointment. I bought non-slip mats for the bathroom and installed grab bars next to the toilet and the shower. And I paid for them myself, without mentioning it, because I didn't want him to feel diminished. Danielle called him that week to check in. I know because he mentioned it. She didn't call me. He was diagnosed with congestive heart failure in early March. I took him to the cardiology appointment where they gave us the news. The doctor was kind and direct and explained what was happening to his heart and what we could expect in terms of his quality of life going forward. My dad sat very still through all of it. He held my hand when the doctor was talking. Afterward, in the car, he was quiet for a long time. And then he said, "I need to make sure some things are in order." "We'll take care of whatever needs taking care of," I said. He looked at me, and for a second something moved across his face. Regret, maybe, or the beginning of it. And then it was gone. "You're a good girl, Claire," he said. "You always have been." I thought that was enough. I thought that meant something. He went downhill fast after that. The last week of March was the hospital, and he died on the morning of the 28th, a Tuesday, with me and Tommy in the room. Danielle had driven in the night before when I called her to say it was close. She was there at the end. She held his hand. She cried. I held his other hand, and I told him I loved him, and I always would. And I think he heard me. And he died at 6:47 in the morning, with the sun coming through the hospital window and making everything orange. I didn't know, in that room, that 4 days later I would be sitting in a lawyer's office, finding out I'd been erased. The will was simple, almost aggressively simple. Everything to Danielle Marie Holloway, née Stanton. The house, the investment accounts, which I hadn't fully known the extent of, but which turned out to be substantial. Just over $400,000, accumulated over decades of running a successful business and living frugally. The business itself, or rather the stake my dad still held in it, which Phil had been buying out slowly, but which still had significant value. A savings account, a car, the furniture, everything. There was one line about me, one line. To my daughter, Claire Elizabeth Mercer, née Stanton, I leave my mother's pearl necklace, which I know she has always loved. A pearl necklace. I sat in the lawyer's chair and I read that line 3 times, and I thought, I don't even have a memory of loving that necklace. I don't know where he got that. I've never once told him I loved that necklace. I've never even worn it. And something about that, the wrongness of that detail, the fact that it was a piece of sentiment that didn't even track, that it was almost randomly assigned, made me understand that I was looking at a document that had been shaped by someone else's hand. I asked the lawyer when the will had been signed. He told me it was dated September 14th of the previous year. That was 6 weeks after Danielle's 4-day visit. 6 weeks after those conversations about life and the future. I asked if there had been a previous will. He said he wasn't able to share information about prior documents. I asked if I could contest it. He said I could consult with an attorney, but that absent evidence of undue influence or lack of mental capacity, wills are difficult to contest. He said it in a measured, professional, not unkind way. And I realized that to him I was just another grieving person in a chair across the desk, and that this was routine to him. And that was perhaps the loneliest part of the whole morning. I drove home in a condition that I can only describe as controlled numbness. I drove the speed limit. I stopped at red lights. I put my blinker on to change lanes. I pulled into my driveway and I sat in the car for 11 minutes without moving. And then I went inside and I sat at the kitchen table and I waited for the feeling to hit me fully. And when it did, it came all at once. The grief and the rage and the bewilderment all collapsed into each other. And I put my face in my hands, and I cried in a way I hadn't cried since the day my mother died. Derek found me there when he came home from work. He didn't say anything for a long moment. He just put his hand on my back and stood there. And then, very quietly, he said, "Tell me everything." I told him everything. Derek is a careful man. He thinks before he speaks. He doesn't get dramatic. So when he looked at me after I finished talking and said, very slowly, "Something doesn't add up," I paid attention to that. It wasn't a comforting thing to say. It wasn't the thing you say to make someone feel better. It was an observation. And the fact that Derek, who always tries to find the charitable interpretation, was saying something didn't add up, that landed differently than if I'd said it to myself. "What do you mean?" I said. "Your dad was not that kind of man," Derek said. "He wasn't perfect, but he knew what you did for him. He held your hand at the cardiologist. He told you you were a good girl. Men who are about to cut their daughters out of their wills don't say things like that. Not sincerely. And your dad was sincere. So what are you saying?" "I'm saying someone got to him," Derek said. "And I think we both know who." We sat at that table for a long time after that. I kept turning the thing over in my mind, looking at it from every angle. Danielle's 4-day visit in September. The will signed 6 weeks later. The way my dad had seemed different after she left. Careful. Word choosing. Closed. The fruit basket for the pneumonia. The absence at Thanksgiving. The 2-day Christmas. And then the drive from Columbus the night before he died, when it was finally, unavoidably necessary to show up. I thought about what Danielle had said to him during those 4 days. I thought about what she might have told him. And then I thought about something else. Something I'd been carrying for almost 3 years. Something I knew about my sister that nobody else in our family knew. Something she had no idea I knew. I'd found out by accident. That's the only way I ever find out things, apparently. 2.5 years before my dad died, I was in Columbus for a work conference. I texted Danielle to see if she wanted to grab lunch, because even though we weren't close, we tried. She said she was too swamped. Maybe next time. I understood. I was actually relieved a little, honestly. because lunches with Danielle required a kind of performance I found exhausting. On my last day in Columbus, I was walking from my hotel to the conference center at 7:30 in the morning, and I passed a coffee shop, and through the window, I saw my sister. She was sitting at a table near the back with a man who was not her husband. I know Marcus. I've spent Christmases with Marcus. The man my sister was sitting with was not Marcus. He was younger, late 30s maybe, dark-haired, wearing a button-down shirt, leaning across the table in that particular way that people lean across tables when what they're saying is important and private. My sister was laughing. She was touching his hand. I walked past the window before she could look up. I kept walking. I went to the conference. I sat through 3 hours of presentations, and I didn't absorb a single word because half my mind was in that coffee shop. I told myself it could be innocent. A colleague, a friend, someone I didn't know. I told myself I had no right to assume. I told myself it was none of my business. But I'm not naive. I know what I saw. And over the months that followed, small things accumulated that confirmed what I'd already understood in that first 30 seconds through the coffee shop window. A moment at Christmas when Danielle's phone lit up on the counter and she grabbed it faster than necessary and tucked it face down. The way Marcus, the last time I really looked at him, had a particular kind of tired in his eyes that I recognized. The tiredness of a man who knows something is wrong in his house, but can't name it. The fact that Danielle started going on girls' weekends with a frequency that struck even my dad as unusual. He'd mentioned it once, lightly. Danielle's been traveling a lot lately. And then he'd smiled, because he found reasons to smile about Danielle. I had never said a word about any of this to anyone. Not to Derek, not to my dad, not to anyone. It was her life. Whatever she was doing, it was her life and her marriage and her choices. I had no interest in blowing up someone else's family, even if that someone had never been particularly kind to me. But then I sat at my kitchen table that night after the will reading, and I thought about what she had done to my family, what she had done to my father, what she had done to me, and something inside me went very quiet. Not angry quiet, not revenge quiet, just still, like a room after a loud sound. I didn't do anything that night, or the next night. I spent the first week after the will reading in a kind of suspended state, going through the motions of grief while underneath it, this other thing was happening. This slow, careful process of thinking. I talked to an estate attorney named Sandra, who a colleague recommended. Sandra was direct and unsentimental, and I liked her immediately. She listened to everything I told her and asked a lot of questions. And then she said what I already sort of knew. Contesting the will would be difficult. The standard of proof for undue influence is high. My dad had been of sound mind. His doctors would attest to that. There were no witnesses to whatever Danielle had said to him during that visit. The fact that he signed the will 6 weeks after her stay was suggestive, but not proof of anything. What would help? I asked. Proof of manipulation, she said. Documented. Letters, emails, texts, recordings. Something where your sister is explicitly trying to alter your father's estate decisions. And if I can't get that, then the will stands. I thanked her, and I went home, and I thought about what she'd said. Proof. I needed proof. Here is the thing about proof. Sometimes you don't go looking for it. Sometimes it finds you. About 3 weeks after the will reading, I got a call from Phil. Phil had run my dad's electrical business for 6 years and was in the process of completing the buyout of my dad's remaining stake, a process that was now, of course, going to Danielle. Phil was a decent man. He'd been genuinely fond of my dad. He called to offer his condolences and to let me know he was reaching out because there were some things about the business transition that he thought I should be aware of. Like what? I said, sitting up a little. Like the fact that your sister called me, Phil said. About 2 weeks before your dad passed. She called me from Columbus and asked me a number of questions about the business valuation, the buyout terms, and what the remaining stake was worth. She was specific. She had numbers I hadn't shared before. She knew things about the business that she shouldn't have known unless someone had given her access to financial documents. I was quiet for a moment. What did you tell her? I told her she'd need to speak to your father directly, Phil said. And then I called your dad and let him know about the conversation. He told me it was fine, he'd handle it. But Claire, I want you to know the number she had. She had the figures from our most recent valuation, which was done in August. That document went to your dad and to his accountant, no one else. The August valuation. Danielle's September visit. Phil, I said slowly, is there any chance you still have a record of that call? He did. His office phone logged the time, date, and number for all incoming calls, and he'd kept the record. He emailed it to me that afternoon. Danielle's cell phone number. September 2nd, 12 days before the will was signed. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was a thread. I started pulling. The first thing I did was call my dad's accountant, the new one he'd switched to 2 years earlier, a woman named Karen, who'd been recommended by someone at the local Chamber of Commerce. I called Karen and explained who I was and that I was trying to understand some things about my dad's estate. Karen was cautious. She said she couldn't share details without proper authorization. I said I understood, and then I asked her one very specific question. Had she sent any estate-related documents to anyone other than my father? There was a pause. I sent a summary of your father's assets to the email address he gave me for his estate planning, Karen said carefully. In August of last year, he said he was updating his will and needed the figures. What email address did he give you? She hesitated. I'm not sure I should. Karen, I said. My father is dead and everything he owned went to my sister, who hadn't visited him in over 2 years. I'm not asking you to break any laws. I'm asking you to tell me if the address he gave you was his own. A longer pause. No, she said finally. It wasn't a personal email. It was a Gmail account. I assumed it was his, but it wasn't his usual one. It had his name in it, but it wasn't the address he normally used. Do you still have that address? I have the sent email, she said, and then she read it to me. It was not my father's email. My father used a Comcast address he'd had since 2006. The address Karen had been given was a Gmail account created with a slight variation of his name. Rob Stanton 57 instead of Rob Stanton 1957. Different enough that you might not catch it if you weren't looking closely. Similar enough to be plausible. Someone had given Karen a decoy email address. Someone who wanted to make sure the asset summary got to them without my father seeing it. I knew in my bones who that someone was. But knowing and proving are different things. I sat with what I had. Phil's call record, Karen's information about the email, the timeline of the September visit and the will signing. It was a picture that told a story. But pictures that tell stories aren't always enough. I needed something else. I thought about it for 2 more days, and then I did something that I'm not entirely proud of, but that I also don't regret at all. I called my cousin Stephanie. Stephanie is my mother's niece, technically not related to Danielle by blood, just by marriage, which meant Danielle had never invested in the relationship the way she invested in relationships that served her. But Stephanie and Danielle had been friendly over the years, in the way of people who see each other at weddings and funerals, and feel a vague warmth without it amounting to much. Stephanie lived in Columbus, same city, and Stephanie, unlike most people I know, had a particular talent for getting people to tell her things. I told Stephanie what I'd found. I told her everything, all of it, including what I'd seen through the coffee shop window 2.5 years ago. I told her about the man at the table. I told her what I suspected Danielle had done to my dad. Stephanie listened without interrupting, and then she said, "I know about the man." I went very still. "What do you mean?" "She's been seeing him for almost 3 years, Stephanie said. "His name is Danielle, which I know, and he works in commercial real estate. They met at some kind of networking event. I found out maybe 8 months ago when I ran into them at a restaurant, and she introduced him as a colleague and then panicked when I mentioned Marcus's name." "Did you say anything to anyone?" "No," Stephanie said. "It wasn't my business. But Claire, if she would do that to Marcus, who she actually chose to be with, what would she do to get her hands on $400,000? We were quiet for a moment with that question between us. "Will you help me?" I said. "Tell me what you need," she said. What I needed was access to the Gmail account, which I obviously didn't have. But what Stephanie suggested was something I hadn't thought of. She reached out to Danielle, casually, the way she occasionally did, just checking in, offering condolences about my dad, asking how she was holding up. They texted back and forth a few times over several days, and during one of those exchanges, Danielle said something that Stephanie screenshotted and sent to me immediately. The message read, "Honestly, I just feel such relief that Dad finally understood where his real support was coming from. It took a while, but we had some really important conversations last fall, and I think he finally saw things clearly." That was it. That was the thing. Not a confession, not explicit, but the phrase, "Dad finally understood where his real support was coming from." In the context of everything else, in the context of a will signed 6 weeks after her visit, in the context of a decoy email and the financial documents that landed in the wrong hands. That phrase was a thread I could use, because it told a story, and stories, told to the right people at the right moment, have a way of changing everything. I had been moving carefully and quietly and alone for weeks. I want to be honest about what that period was like, because I think people romanticize revenge. They think it's satisfying in the moment, that it feels good even as you're planning it. It doesn't. It felt terrible. It felt like grief on top of grief on top of grief. I missed my dad every single day. I missed the version of him I'd believed in, the one who held my hand at the cardiologist and called me a good girl. And I had to keep reconciling that person with the person who had signed the will that erased me. I still don't know how much of what Danielle did he knew about. I don't know if the decoy email was her idea or his, or if he gave Karen that address without knowing what he was giving, or if by the end he had just been so completely shaped by whatever story Danielle had told him that he believed it was right. I'll never know. That uncertainty is its own kind of loss. But I also knew that Danielle had not gotten what she had through love. She had gotten it through calculation. She had shown up for 4 days after 2 years of absence. And she had worked on a dying old man. And she had walked away with $400,000 and the house and the business stake. And she was sending text messages to my cousin, describing it as the moment her father finally understood. That wasn't grief. That was a closing statement. I made an appointment with Sandra, the estate attorney. I brought everything: Phil's call record, Karen's information about the decoy email, Stephanie's screenshot. Sandra looked at it all very carefully, and then she looked at me. "This isn't enough to win in court," she said. "You know that." "I know," I said, "but it might be enough for something else." "Tell me what you're thinking," I said. Sandra leaned back. "Your sister manipulated your father's estate planning, using information she obtained through a fraudulent email account. That's not a civil matter. That's potentially fraud, which means it's potentially a matter for the district attorney." I had thought about this. I had thought about it a lot, actually. About what happened to a person when they got investigated for fraud. About what that meant for their marriage, their reputation, their life. I had thought about Marcus and the kids. And I had decided something, sitting at my kitchen table in the middle of the night after Derek was asleep, staring at the ceiling and listening to the house settle around me. The kids were innocent. They had nothing to do with this. Whatever happened, I wanted to be the kind of person who knew the difference between a target and collateral damage. But Danielle herself, Danielle had made her choices. Danielle had sat in my father's house for 4 days and worked on him and walked away with his estate and felt relief about it. And Marcus, well, Marcus had a right to know what kind of marriage he was in. "I want to try the DA's office," I told Sandra. "And I want to talk to Marcus." Sandra looked at me carefully. "The second part isn't legal strategy." "No," I said, "it's not." I contacted the district attorney's office through Sandra, and they referred us to an investigator who handled financial fraud cases. The investigator, a woman named Trevino, who looked like she'd heard every variety of family disaster and was not surprised by any of them, took my materials and told me they'd look into it and be in touch. She didn't promise anything. She was clear about the challenges, but she also said, with a particular kind of flatness, that the decoy email was a problem for Danielle because it demonstrated premeditation and intent to deceive. That was in May. In June, I called Marcus. I had gone back and forth about this more than anything else. Derek thought I should leave Marcus out of it. He said it wasn't my place. He said it would make everything more complicated and messier, and it would hurt people who hadn't done anything to me. He wasn't wrong about any of those things. But here's what I kept coming back to. Marcus had 2 children with a woman who was betraying him, and he had a right to make his own decisions about his own life based on true information. That didn't feel like cruelty to me. That felt like respect. I called him on a Tuesday afternoon. He answered on the second ring. "Claire," he said. He sounded cautious but not unfriendly. "I've been meaning to reach out. I'm sorry about your dad." "Thank you," I said. And then I didn't hedge. I didn't build up to it. I just said, "Marcus, I need to tell you some things about your wife, and I need you to hear me out before you respond." There was silence, and then, with a quietness that told me he had been waiting for something like this for a long time. "Okay." I told him about the man at the coffee shop. I told him what Stephanie had found out. I told him about Daniel, the name, the 3 years, the commercial real estate. I told him about the will and the decoy email, and what Danielle had texted to Stephanie about my father finally understanding. I told him all of it, and I listened to him breathe on the other end of the line. And I didn't fill the silences. When I finished, he was quiet for a very long time. "How long have you known about Daniel?" he said finally. "About 2.5 years," I said. "I saw them in a coffee shop when I was in Columbus for work. I didn't say anything because I thought it was your business and Danielle's business, not mine. I'm telling you now because I think you deserve to know, and because it's part of a larger picture that I think matters for both of us." More silence. "I appreciate you telling me," he said. His voice was very steady, the kind of steady that costs something. We talked for another 20 minutes. Marcus asked careful, specific questions about the will, about the investigation, about what I was hoping to happen. He didn't make promises. He didn't tell me what he was going to do. But at the end of the call, he said, "For what it's worth, Claire, I don't think what Danielle did to your father was right. And I don't think what she's been doing to me is right either. I think we have some things to figure out." "I think so too," I said. I didn't hear from him again for almost 3 weeks. What happened in those 3 weeks, I've had to piece together from various sources, from what Marcus eventually told me, from what Stephanie heard, from what came out later. Marcus, apparently, did what Derek does when confronted with something difficult. He thought carefully before acting. He had a conversation with his own attorney. He made some inquiries. And then, and this is the part I hadn't predicted, he went through Danielle's email. He knew her password because she'd given it to him years ago for some logistical reason, and they'd never changed it. He went through her email, and he found the Gmail account, the Rob Stanton 57 account, my father's fake email. The account was registered to Danielle, and in the account were the emails from Karen the accountant, the asset summary, the financial figures, everything Karen had sent, thinking she was sending it to my father. They were right there, untouched, archived. Marcus forwarded them to his attorney. His attorney forwarded them to Sandra. Sandra forwarded them to Trevino. That was in early July. Trevino called me on a Thursday afternoon, the same measured flat voice as always, and told me that the investigation had progressed, and that charges were being considered, and that I should expect to hear more in the coming weeks. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. I sat in my car after that call, and I thought about my dad. I thought about the morning he died, the orange light through the hospital window, the way he'd held my hand at the cardiologist. I thought about the pearl necklace I'd never loved. I thought about what he'd been told about me to make him believe that leaving me nothing was acceptable. I wondered if Danielle had told him I didn't need it, or that I was doing well, or that I'd said something about the money I'd never said. I wondered if she'd told him I didn't visit enough, didn't care enough, wasn't there enough. I wondered if he'd believed it, or if somewhere in him he'd known it wasn't true and simply hadn't been strong enough, at the end, to hold the line against his favorite daughter. I decided I would never know, and I had to let that be okay. The charges came in August. Fraud and financial elder abuse. The elder abuse charge specifically because my father had been elderly, ill, and in a vulnerable position when the manipulation occurred. The DA's office was explicit about the decoy email being central to the case. It demonstrated that Danielle had deliberately intercepted financial information she had no right to, and had used it to position herself advantageously in her father's estate planning. The will could be challenged on the grounds of undue influence, supported by fraudulent conduct. Danielle was charged on a Friday. By Monday, the news was in the local paper in our hometown in Ohio. Small-town papers cover things like this. People talked. They talked at the hardware store and at the diner where my dad used to have breakfast on Saturday mornings, and at the church where we'd both been baptized, and where his funeral had been held 6 months earlier. The Stanton family, the Rob Stanton family, the man who'd built a good business and raised 2 daughters and worked hard for 30 years. His younger daughter had defrauded him. I didn't enjoy the talking. I want to be clear about that. I didn't enjoy any of it. The version of this that people imagine, the satisfying moment, the sweet revenge, the triumphant feeling, that's not what it felt like. What it felt like was sad. Sad in a way that doesn't have a bottom. Because the person who got hurt, at the center of all of it, was my father. And he was gone. And nothing that happened now would change what had happened to him, or give me back the years I'd spent believing he loved me unconditionally, when what he loved, it turned out, was a story about me that wasn't entirely true. Marcus filed for divorce in September. He told me later, when we'd talked a few more times and something approaching an unlikely friendship had started to form, that the affair had been going on for longer than 3 years, closer to 4. That Daniel was not the first, that he'd suspected for a while, but hadn't wanted to face it for the kids' sake, and that my call in June had given him what he needed to stop pretending. "I'm sorry," I told him. I meant it. "Don't be," he said. I needed someone to tell me the truth. The estate case ran alongside the criminal case in a complicated way that Sandra navigated with a patience that I will be grateful for the rest of my life. The will was challenged on grounds of undue influence and fraud. The evidence, the decoy email account, Phil's call records, Karen's testimony about the asset summary, Stephanie's screenshot, and Marcus's discovery of the Gmail archive, was substantial. Danielle's attorney made arguments about my father's right to dispose of his estate as he wished, and those arguments weren't baseless, because legally, a person can leave their money to whoever they want. But the decoy email changed the calculation. The decoy email showed that the information used to shape my father's decisions had been obtained through deception. In November, 8 months after my dad died, the estate was settled through a negotiated agreement. Danielle, facing both the criminal charges and the estate challenge and the collapse of her marriage, agreed to a split, 60% to her, 40% to me. It wasn't equal. It wasn't what it should have been, but it was $420,000 less the attorney's fees, which was something. It was something real. The criminal case was still pending at the time of the settlement. Her attorney was working on a plea deal. I had been told I would have the opportunity to provide a victim impact statement, and I was still deciding what I wanted to say. I want to tell you about the day I went to pick up the pearl necklace. As part of the estate settlement, I was entitled to some of the personal property that had been in my dad's house, the house that Danielle had already put on the market. There was a day in October where I went with Derek to walk through the house one last time and collect the things that were mine. And Danielle was supposed to be there, but sent her attorney instead, which I think tells you everything about where we were by that point. The house smelled the same, coffee and wood, and something indefinable that was just him, his house smell. I walked through the kitchen and the living room and his little office, and everything was staged now, decluttered, the way houses look when they're for sale, like a house trying to look like no one ever really lived there. I stood in the office for a minute and looked at the desk where I'd seen the will folder through the half-open door 14 months ago. The desk was still there. The folder was gone. The pearl necklace was in my mother's jewelry box in the bedroom. I'd assumed it would be hard to find, but it wasn't. The jewelry box was on the dresser, and the necklace was inside, coiled on a little velvet cushion. I picked it up and held it for a minute. It was pretty, delicate, the kind of thing my mother would have worn to church on Easter. I don't know why my dad thought I'd always loved it. Maybe it was a real memory from somewhere that I couldn't access, or maybe it was a detail that someone else had supplied. I put it in my pocket, and I walked out of the house, and I didn't look back. I wear the necklace sometimes now, not because I love it exactly, but because it's mine, and because it's the one thing he left me that came from my grandmother. And there's something in that I've decided to hold on to instead of being bitter about. It's small, but I'm learning that small things can carry a lot. It's been about a year now. More than a year, counting from the beginning of all of this. Tommy is doing well. He asks about Grandpa sometimes, in the way that 8-year-olds ask about death, matter-of-factly, then move on. I tell him Grandpa loved him very much, which is true. That part is completely true. And I leave the rest of it aside. Derek and I are okay. Better than okay, honestly. There's something that happens to a marriage when you go through something like this together. You find out what you're made of, both of you. Derek sat at my kitchen table through every step of this, and never once told me I was wrong, or that I should let it go. He told me the truth when I needed it, and held my hand when I needed that instead. and I am more grateful for him than I have words for. Stephanie and I are close now, in a way we never were before. She came to visit last spring, and we sat on my back porch and drank wine and didn't talk about Danielle for a single second, and it was the best evening I'd had in a long time. Phil sold the remaining stake in the business to a partner and retired. He sent me a card when the estate was settled that said he was sorry for how things had gone, and that my dad had talked about me more than I probably knew. I read that card several times. Marcus and I have a strange sort of phone friendship now. We've talked maybe 6 or 7 times since the summer. He's doing okay. The kids are okay. He moved into an apartment in Columbus, and he's figuring out what the next chapter looks like. He told me last month that he'd started therapy, which I think is the most courageous thing, and I told him so. Danielle took a plea deal in December. Probation, community service, a fine. No prison time, which I was fine with. I hadn't wanted her in prison. I'd wanted accountability. And in the collapsing of her life in the years since my father died, accountability had arrived in ways that were hard to miss. She lost the estate settlement, the house, the business stake, her marriage, her reputation in the town where we grew up. The glossy life in the Columbus suburb had fractured along every scene. I don't know where she is now exactly. I don't follow it. I made a decision, somewhere in the late fall, that I was done letting her take up space in my head that belonged to better things. There is one more thing I need to tell you, and it's the thing I come back to most often. About a month after my dad died, before I'd found out everything I found out, I was going through some boxes of his things that Danielle had agreed to send me. A few photographs, some personal items, his watch. In one of the boxes, underneath a pile of old birthday cards and Christmas cards, I found a letter. It was in an envelope with my name on it, in his handwriting. The seal was broken. Someone had opened it before it reached me. The letter was short. He'd written it in January, after the fall in the bathroom, before the heart failure diagnosis. His handwriting was shaky, not like his usual handwriting, and some of the words were hard to read. But I read it. He wrote, "Claire, I've been meaning to say some things to you that I've never said right. You have been the steadiest person in my life for a long time, and I don't know if I've told you that the way I should have. You take care of people. You took care of me. Your mother would be so proud of you, and so am I, more than I've known how to say. There are some things I'm working through about the future. I don't want you to worry. You will always be my daughter, and I love you. Dad." The envelope had been opened. The letter had been in a box with other things, not left separately for me. Whether it was meant to come with a changed will, whether it was meant to be accompanied by a conversation that never happened, whether it was something he wrote and then felt unable to act on, I don't know. I'll never know. But he wrote it. He wrote it in January, with shaky handwriting, in the cold of a bad winter, and he said that I was the steadiest person in his life, and that my mother would be proud of me. I keep the letter in the drawer of my nightstand. Some nights, I take it out and read it again. It doesn't fix anything. It doesn't undo anything. But it tells me who he was, at his core, underneath whatever had happened and whatever had been said to him. It tells me that somewhere in him, he knew. He knew what I was. He knew what I'd given. And I think that's what I hold on to when I'm done being angry and done grieving and done working through the tangle of it all. He knew. And in the end, he tried to say so. The pearl necklace sits on my dresser now. On the nights when everything feels like too much, I look at it. This small, delicate thing that belongs to me, that came from my grandmother, that arrived in my hands through the strangest and most painful set of circumstances I've ever navigated. And I think about what steady means. It means you're still here. Through all of it, you're still here. And I am.